Hello, welcome back to Straightforward, our open political debate show brought to you by Levant TV with me, Khalil Khawairi. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly, the British Prime Minister insisted that for extremism to be defeated, it needs to be dealt with in all its forms, suggesting banning preachers of hate. Mr. Cameron drew the line between freedom of speech and national security. Meanwhile, US Vice President Joe Biden tells Harvard students that Turkey, the UAE and Saudi Arabia had extended billions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons to Sunni fighters battling Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's forces. So how is ISIS the richest terror group ever, and how is the money channeled through? We will discuss foreign policy in Europe and the West in relation to the clearly visible crackdown on terror money and ideology. Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, Mr. Robert Olds, Director of the Bruges Group, and thank you very much for being with us on the show. Before delving into our discussion, let's watch together this brief report.
The Islamic State group is growing financially and militarily, but their greatest financial triumph came in June when they captured Mosul. The group has been named the wealthiest terror group in the world, with US intelligence officials and experts claiming that the group takes in more than $3 million a day through oil smuggling, extortion, theft, and human trafficking. Last week, US Vice President Joe Biden declared at Harvard University that the biggest problem the United States faced in dealing with Syria and the rise of the Islamic State was America's allies in the region, pointing at Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan demanded an apology, and the White House confirmed that Mr. Biden had complied, making a telephone call to the Turkish leader. A day after, the Vice President called the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, after UAE requested a formal clarification from Biden. Qatar, another Gulf ally of the US, has also been accused of financing terrorist groups. The United States says it does not have evidence that the government of Qatar is funding the Islamic State, but it does believe that private individuals in Qatar are helping to finance this group and others like it, and it thinks the Gulf state is not doing enough to stop this. Private research and advocacy group Counter-Extremism Project says the sudden rise of the well-armed, well-financed and media-savvy Islamic State militant group could not have come about unless unscrupulous companies and individuals slipped money to the group or did business with it. But what or who is funding the group?
Robert Olds, welcome again. What are your thoughts on the Prime Minister's address to the UN General Assembly when it comes to cracking down on radical Islamist ideology on UK soil?
There is a problem within the UK of certain hate preachers, as they've become known, who are preaching, in a sense, a situation where encouraging people to take violence against other people. And that cannot be accepted, it cannot be tolerated, and we need to be very firm with this, that some people who advocate others being hurt and endorse terrorism and terrorist groups should be put politically and actually beyond the pale, as we say.
Who are these people, frankly, here in the UK? Who are these?
Well, they're a very small minority, but they're very vocal and they're very good at getting media headlines and getting attention, and that's actually bad for Britain because it's putting different groups against each other. They claim to be representing Islam when in reality they're not. They only represent really themselves and a few other people who want to spread hate and encourage division. Mm-hmm. But they are a problem, and some people who are susceptible to their message, that may feel alienated from British society, are sometimes seduced by them. And that's actually very dangerous and very worrying.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the previous Labour governments are in a way responsible to what Britain is suffering from today, especially when English Islamist fighters in Syria are the highest amongst foreign fighters from the West? So a campaign to join the Islamic State even has been launched on Oxford Street in London, raising Al-Qaeda-like flags in Canary Wharf. Would you blame the previous Labour governments for this?
I think there has been a problem with previous governments, and this is largely continued by the existing government, but the previous Labour government of Tony Blair had an experiment in multiculturalism, that everybody could be as they wanted to be, which is fine, but of course there was no underwriting narrative that brought people together. So some groups became divided, people beginning to live in their own communities, not taking part in the wider British society, and then ultimately became alienated. And then of course found a route to express themselves through various extremist groups. So really this is largely, I think, the failure of multiculturalism and some people wanting to search for a brand, an identity, something to belong to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. But in your opinion, who is mobilising when it comes to the UK? and funding all this? Because these hate preachers and even sometimes they're going under charities. People speculate that they are starting as a charity supposedly for cultural or social engagement when it comes to Muslim communities, interacting with British people or vice versa, introducing British people to Islam and this sort of thing, which is supposedly peaceful. But who is funding them, and why are they going under the umbrellas of charities?
Well, there has been a number of cases where people were collecting for charities, such as there was one which is a reputable, respectable, I understand, charity called Muslim Aid, but some people pretending to be collecting for those charities to use their funds for their nefarious terrorist means. But there is money that's coming in from, not just from, there will be some collected within the UK, but in many countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There are individuals there in Kuwait that are funding extremist groups within the Middle East that are really bringing terror to, well, the Middle East and beyond.
Let's talk now to Dr. Stephen Lendman and see what he has to say. Mr. Stephen Lendman, Research Associate at the Center for Research on Globalization and show host of Lendman NewsHour on Republic Broadcasting. Thank you very much for being on our show.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor to be on with you.
Steve, tell us a little bit about the difference, if any, between funding terror and supporting rebels in Syria militarily, including what's been recently referred to as moderate rebels. Where's the thin line there?
Well, on the one hand, America's so-called war on terror is really America's war of terror against free people around the world. America always needs enemies. America has none, so it needs to invent them. It needs to scare people. It needs to do it to get people to support its imperial agenda. And the way I like to put it so often is saying it involves ravaging and destroying one country after another, or carving up whole continents for profit and dominance, subjugating people, stealing the resources of nations. This has been America's long-standing agenda for many, many years, internally and externally. Post 9/11, it's been especially horrific. I think most everybody is familiar with what's gone on. Yes. The horrific wars that have raged in Eurasia, the Middle East, they go on nonstop.
Steve, you criticize mainstream media, calling them propaganda horns. Who are you talking exactly? Who are you talking about there?
When I speak of the mainstream media, I'm talking about television mainly, because that's where people in Western societies mostly go to get their information. So in America, they'll watch the cable television channels or the broadcasters, CBS, NBC, so on. In Europe, they'll watch the BBC. In Canada, the CBC.
Yes, so what's wrong with these?
Well, they're not legitimate news services. They're propaganda services. They preach the party line, the official statements, the official policies of the governments where they're based, and they simply regurgitate official policies. I call them big lies. They bury important truths. They don't tell people what they really need to know, and they simply repeat big lies propaganda over and over again. And sometimes it's so shocking, because anybody with any knowledge about what's going on the most fundamental things, to view what they say on television, to read what the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal puts in print, even people with minimal knowledge know that this stuff that they're putting out is absolute rubbish.
But they are raising concerns about the threat of radical jihadi ideology, be it in the Middle East or back on American soil. So do you believe the media is waging a war by raising concerns of national security?
Well, again, on the one hand, it's doing this to get people to support America's imperial agenda. America faces no threat whatsoever. The only so-called threats are the ones America invents, and America loves the extremists, Islamists, or anything you want to call them. The Islamic State, also called ISIL or ISIS, the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, and similar groups are U.S. creations. America creates these groups. It goes back to the 1980s, the Mujahideen, who were used to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Bin Laden was a CIA asset. He didn't realize he was a CIA asset, but he was through Pakistan's ISI, Pakistan's equivalent of America's CIA. And again, this is the way America operates. It needs these extremist groups to further its ideology. So it used the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. It uses Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and so on against Syria, against the Assad government. It did the same thing in Libya against the Gaddafi government. And it rages about how outrageous these people are, but they're really America's foot soldiers. It's boots on the ground. It's proxy army. This is what the dirty game is all about.
Steve Lendman, a writer and syndicated columnist, activist, News TV personality, and columnist also at Veterans News Now. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Robert, there are reports on ISIS selling oil en masse to Turkey and then Turkey reselling this oil to other countries in the EU. That's reports, it's not me saying it, of course. Now, how does that affect Britain being member of the EU and at the same time one of the biggest major players in the US-led coalition fighting ISIS, yet at the same time the EU is indirectly buying oil through Turkey from ISIS?
Yeah, Britain is in an invidious position. They're Britain's allies, of course, the United States allies, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Many of those countries are enabling ISIS to receive their weapons, to receive their funding, and, of course, as you mentioned, to sell their oil, which is really just a remarkable circumstance where the whole British foreign policy is completely misguided. There's been a real situation that's emerged where actually the United States and Britain has actually found itself allied with countries who are encouraging destabilisation, encouraging terrorist groups. And that is reality of what's happening. Turkey, of course, could seal the border. It could stop foreign fighters, many of which come from Britain, joining ISIS. It could stop purchasing the oil. But, of course, I feel that Turkey has its own agenda, and some people may be finding ISIS to be a useful tool for their political gains.
And now we'll talk to Professor Max Abrahms, Assistant Professor of Public Policy in Political Science. Thank you very much for joining us. Sure. Professor Abrahms, in what ways could the Obama administration have been more efficient in cracking down on terrorism funders?
Well, I've been a critic of Obama's response to ISIS broadly for many, many months. For one thing, the United States responded to ISIS way too late. This summer, it was widely reported that ISIS was gobbling up large swaths of land in both Syria and Iraq. And just a couple of weeks ago, Obama put the blame actually on the intelligence that he was getting, saying that, we didn't really know about the full strength of Islamic State or ISIS. But that's not true. I mean, just from opening the newspapers, from reading the newspapers at the time, I was thinking that our response was way too slow. And then when we did get involved, we only got involved in Iraq, and that began on August 8th. And of course, ISIS is based primarily not in Iraq, but mainly in Syria. Most ISIS fighters are in Syria, not Iraq. And Syria is a Sunni majority country, and ISIS is a radical Sunni group. So its potential for growth always really rested in Syria, not Iraq. And it's really only been within the past couple weeks that we've been involved at all in Syria. And our approach to Syria is very, very underdeveloped. From the beginning, Washington said that it wasn't going to work with Damascus. And it's a basic principle of counterinsurgency that you need local support on the ground if you are to win it. And so without being able to use the Assad regime's forces, that left us with the so-called moderate Syrian rebels. And of course, they're not very moderate. Most of them have ties with Al-Qaeda. They're very, very weak. And furthermore, they don't even really like the United States. And we're hardly even talking with them. We haven't even begun in Syria the vetting process to try to identify these so-called moderates with whom we could work, never mind having started to even train them. And so once that begins, it should take about a year for us to assemble a force of about 5,000 actors on the ground. And that pales in comparison to ISIS, which has tens and thousands of members in Syria alone. And so overall, the Obama administration's response to Islamic State makes very little sense. Now, some people might say, well, the United States is really going to hurt this group from the air. And yet our airstrikes have been very, very limited, actually. If you compare our air campaign, say, to what we did against the Taliban after 9/11, I mean, this is just a very, very slow-paced
Exactly. That's what I was trying to get to.
We have planes going overhead, but not really firing at anything. We don't have any support on the ground where ISIS is mainly based. And so overall, the U.S. response to this group has been extraordinarily poor.
And back to your point, comparing with the crackdown on the Taliban, don't you think by now ISIS should be finished with all this military offensive launched by the U.S. and its coalition?
Well, not only is ISIS not finished, but it looks like ISIS is just getting ramped up. There are really two different theaters that are operating sort of separately. There's the situation in Iraq and there's the situation in Syria. In Iraq, the United States is advantaged in comparison to in Syria because we do have local actors on the ground, fighters on the ground with whom we could work in the form of the Peshmerga fighters. We have better relations with the Iraqi federal government. There's some Shia militia. And then coupled with that, there's some U.S. air power. And you add all those things together, and we're in a better position than we are in Syria. But even in Iraq,
I'm sorry, I'm not even
ISIS
sure that
is
America
making
really does want to tackle
towards Baghdad,
ISIS.
securing that area. Baghdad could fall to the hands of ISIS. And in Syria, the situation
one second,
is even more
Max
dire.
Abrahams, 1 second.
Today,
Mr. Olzir at the studio would like to interject.
Is on the precipice of a massacre.
Stay with us,
forces
Dr. Abrahams.
Continue to move their way further and further into that town. There are about 700 Kurdish fighters who are fighting against many, many more ISIS fighters who have better weaponry. Yes. And frankly, the U.S. airstrikes are just too
Dr.
little,
Abrahams,
too late.
Can you hear me? Just stay with us. Robert Olzir at the studio would like to interject.
Yeah, I think that it's not a situation that from America it's too little too late. America only got concerned about ISIS when ISIS threatened the oil fields in northern Iraq and was in danger of threatening their project to create some new democratic situation in Iraq, which is always a fantasy and actually created a lot of the instability which has led to the growth of these extremist groups. And America has been wedded to the idea of removing President Assad from Syria, yet not really tackling the problem of ISIS. ISIS have been around for many years now. It's been apparent what they've been doing. They've been in Syria. They've been attacking the Kurdish population for well over a year now, forcing people out of Syria into northern Iraq. They've been very much involved. America has been wedded to the idea of removing regimes such as Syria and not actually getting to grips with ISIS. So it's not that they're incompetent, it's not that they can't actually deal with ISIS, it's if they don't want to because they do not want the Syrian government to restore control over large parts of its own country.
When you mentioned they've been there for many years, are they a rebranding of Al-Qaeda? Is that what you mean?
No, they've actually existed as an offshoot from Al-Qaeda for a number of years now. They were, of course, part of it, but have since grown and, of course, received a lot of funding. They're from countries that are, of course, very strangely allied to the United States of America. Saudi Arabia is described as a key ally of the United States, yet that is a major source of funding for ISIS. Turkey as well.
So where does
Qatar.
Al-Qaeda stand now in the eyes of the West?
Well, that's a very interesting situation because, of course, the Americans are now talking about encouraging the Saudis to do more to support the so-called moderate groups, which are, of course, linked to Al-Qaeda. So, perversely, the United States has become allied with Saudi Arabia and its client groups, which are extreme and little better than Al-Qaeda, and in some cases allied.
Yes, but then again, isn't it a bit tricky because they're all linked to Al-Qaeda in a way, as you say, even the moderate ones. Yet at the same time, the Prime Minister and President Obama insist that there should be a regime change in Syria. So how does that make them look?
Well, America should realise that its actions destabilising the Syrian government have actually created a situation that's made this worse. At the moment, President Assad is fighting ISIS, and we should really re-evaluate Western foreign policy. Forget the idea of regime change. Look at what the Western countries did in Libya, and now look at the situation there. A government which was against Islamic radicals is now, of course, been removed, and there's a situation where there's a free fall. The same within Syria as well, and of course Iraq. America has destabilised these countries in a bid to create regime change, which of course doesn't work. It just creates a situation where these extremist groups come to the fore. But America has found them quite useful to fight against its own, to fight against the forces that it's opposed to. But it really should evaluate who its friends are and its enemies.
Yes. Max Abrahms, do you agree, very briefly, before you leave us today?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a op-ed in the New York Times basically arguing many of those points months ago. Yes, I've been in favor of Washington actually working with Damascus and not in favor of regime change. And that's because the U.S. has very, very few allies. This was my entire point. The United States needs fighters on the ground, and they're not coming from the moderates. And so the only alternative was to use Assad's forces, or to maybe scale back U.S. objectives away from the idea of destroying the Islamic State and more towards degrading it.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Max Abrahams, terrorism analyst and counterterrorism strategy advisor. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Back to you, Robert. Do you have anything to add first to what Max has just said?
Yeah, the analysis from Professor Abrahams was absolutely correct. Of course,
you seem to disagree.
Well, I disagreed at the point that he thought that this was somewhat a situation where America wasn't being wholehearted in its opposition to ISIS. But of course, the situation is that really it's found ISIS to be a useful tool, and only when, of course, ISIS threatened the American project in Iraq was America got involved, and now it's still wedded to the idea of regime change in Syria and doesn't want to do too much against ISIS. Otherwise, they fear that President Assad and his government will take back control of large parts of Syria. So really, the Americans really need to recognise that they've really destabilise the country, encourage a situation where ISIS have come to the fore.
Yes.
And of course it's ISIS who are benefiting from using many American weapons that have been captured and of course supplied by so-called allies, which American finds useful in its geopolitical games to use against countries like Iran and other regimes or other governments that America has a dispute with.
I think Abraham's concerns were mostly overlapping with former Secretary Hillary Clinton's concerns when it came to the timing to crack down on the opposition on Syria. But now we are joined by Dr. Kevin Barrett, Arabist Islamologist and America's best-known critic of the war on terror. Welcome on Straightforward.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Dr. Barrett, you are clearly very critical of the administration's anti-Islamic State campaign. Tell us more about that.
Well, it was actually the U.S. and its regional allies who created this so-called Islamic State. It was, of course, created to try to destabilize Syria. And now they say it's gotten out of control and they want to crack down on it. But it doesn't seem that any effective way of cracking down has been offered. Obviously, the U.S. would have to work not only with the regional allies who helped create Islamic State to put a damper on it, but they also need to cooperate with the government of Syria, the government of Iran, various parties in Lebanon, and other regional actors. And yet it seems as though they're not willing to do that. And it leads many people to wonder whether this huge propaganda campaign in the U.S. saying that we're going to war against Islamic State isn't just another charade and a deception.
Dr. Barrett, you mentioned in a recent publication that as per LiveLeak, the campaign reaches its $500 billion projection. LiveLeak said that, and they also added that it's a $30 million spending per member of the Islamic State radical fighters. Now, while this is an interesting, although unusual way of viewing numbers, what is LiveLeak or yourself trying to imply there?
Well, essentially, I hope these numbers are exaggerated, but even
But
if
you
they
do
are,
mention them in your piece. That I quoted this
well,
from
yes,
your
yes,
piece.
I know, I do, because it's the kind of high-range estimate that shows just how ridiculously expensive this whole so-called war on terror is, and how few results we're getting for the massive amount of money that's being spent. There have been other studies like this that showed that the amount of money spent per so-called terrorist in this war on terror is so much that it would be cheaper to just hand the however many $1 million it is to each of these so-called terrorists and
Yes.
buy them off and send them off to live on the Riviera. And the U.S. is bankrupted
But
itself due to
is
the
this a
so-called war
valid
on
thing?
terror.
Although you're being obviously sarcastic there, but is it a valid thing to write in the media, Dr. Barrett?
Well, yes, I think that we do need to focus on the fact that this so-called war on terror has been a hoax in so many ways, and that the amount of money that's being thrown at this alleged problem, which is not a problem in the U.S., it is other places, but here in the U.S., you're more likely to be hit by lightning or to drown in your bathtub than to be killed by a terrorist.
Yes, Dr. Barrett, Mr. Olzier at the studio would like to interject.
The war on terror doesn't actually exist. What America says is a war on terror is actually a war against secular regimes. The regime such as in Iraq under Saddam Hussein was, of course, originally a secular regime. Of course, there was a parting of the ways when America actually gave, or the American ambassador appeared to give the green light for Iraq to go into Kuwait in 1990. But of course, there's also the war on terror is being used to justify opposition to the secular regime of President Assad in Syria. So really, there isn't actually a war on terror. It's actually not only a misnomer, as you mentioned, it's a hoax. It is a way of bringing America into the affairs of the Middle East to create regime change and create instability. They're not actually targeting the terrorists. They're actually creating a situation where the terrorists are actually benefiting from the instability spread by the United States and its allies.
Do you agree, Dr. Barrett?
I think that's largely true, although I wouldn't call it simply a war on secular regimes. It's also a war on Islamic regimes in the sense that it's a war on Iran, the Islamic Republic, which has been a stable and relatively successful independent nation now since the 1979 revolution. And they also were perfectly happy to overthrow the government, the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, and put in place this puppet regime, a more secular regime of General al-Sisi. So I don't think it's just about secular versus religious. I think it's more of a question of imperial puppets versus independence. They don't want any genuinely independent and successful governments or countries in the Middle East, whether or not they're calling themselves Islamic or secular or what have you. The real issue is the empire and the Zionists want to have complete control of the region, and they're overthrowing independent countries, and they're trying to install either destabilized failed states or puppet regimes.
That is true, but it's not just that, it's also the dollar system. America wants to keep countries tied to buying and selling oil in dollars. That is what the American economy really does depend on. Otherwise, the value of the US dollar would collapse, and its debts are so great that would cause a great deal of instability for the United States. So it seems that when a country has a policy of trying to move away from payments of international trade, particularly oil in dollars, then of course it gets the Pentagon on its case. So really the dollar is in a sense a currency that's backed by the Pentagon. And we see the same situation with America trying to destabilise Russia as well. It really is a large part of this is to do with supporting the US dollar.
Robert and Dr. Barrett, stay with us here. We are now joined by Asghar Bukhari, founding member of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee in the UK. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Bukhari, what do you think of people who believe that Islamic State terrorists have not harmed Israel, particularly throughout the Gaza conflict? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think every Muslim was shocked because not only did they not harm Israel, they made no overt statement saying they were outraged or they wanted to support their brothers in Palestine. They almost ignored the conflict wholesale. They were more interested, it seemed, in their sectarian vision of their Islamic State than they were in helping what is considered as the number one problem in the Muslim world, and what all the Muslims see as the kind of chief sore in the Muslim world, Israel. Shocking, pretty unbelievable.
Dr. Barrett, do you agree?
It's quite stunning the way that so-called Islamic State is actually working with Israel. They've had fighters who've been treated in Israel, visited by Netanyahu. They are not in the least bit opposed
but
to
why are we
Zionism,
getting
which
into
has
this
taken over
discourse
the
now? They are
Islamically
not there
administered
to
Holy Land. This
protect
has been
Palestine.
Holy Land that's been essentially part
Their main
of the Muslim
agenda is not
Ummah
protecting
for
Palestine.
14 centuries, and
Dr.
yet
Barrett, why
this
are
so-called
we
Islamic State
getting
is
into
working with them rather than against them.
thought now? What do they have to do with Israel and defending Palestine anyway?
Right, they're not interested in that. Actually, I think Islamic State, in a way, is a mirror image of Israel, which I've started
Based
calling
on
it
what?
Jewish state. That's what they call themselves. And Jewish state and Islamic State are almost the same thing. They're both extremely fanatical, sectarian outfits who believe in committing atrocities against anybody who doesn't share their warped and narrow version of their religion or of the heresy. I would say both of these groups are really not, the Islamic State isn't real Muslims and Jewish state isn't real Jews. Both of these groups represent heresies, modernist heresies that broke away from the original religions.
Yes. Asghar, do you believe a primitive group like it's been described as a primitive group? Do you think they can even contemplate attacking a state like Israel with highly advanced military capabilities?
I mean, I don't think that they're frightened of Israel. I mean, they seem so fanatical. They don't think they're frightened of anything. They're more than willing to take on America. But I just think that they're so sectarian in their ideology that their number one enemy is not America. It is not Israel. It is not the people that are murdering their brothers. Their vision, it seems to be, solely about killing the other sect.
Not even that. I disagree because at the moment the ISIS are killing Kurdish people in Syrian Kurdistan, and that is largely people who are also Sunni. They may not be particularly strict Sunni, but that would be a matter for them to decide. So really, it does seem that there is a very big problem with, of course, ISIS, but its main targets are other Muslims, be they Shia, of course, also those who are also Christian, but also they're also targeting Sunnis as well. At the moment, the people in Kobani who are fighting against ISIS are Sunnis, and of course, ISIS are a warped form of Sunni Islam, the Wahhabist or the Takfiris, whatever they wish to call themselves or whatever we call them. But I think there is an issue there, is that they don't want to attack Israel. Perhaps that's because they are allied in terms of ISIS being with American allies such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, though people within those countries, and don't actually want to provoke too strong a reaction from America, because of course there's nothing that will upset America more than someone threatening Israel. Hence, of course, so much destabilization in the Middle East.
Asghar, one question. While the Prime Minister is in his address to the UN General Assembly recently said that they will crack down, they are hoping to crack down on hate preachers within the UK and all that. But meanwhile, where did they acquire those top-of-the-range SUVs and Toyota trucks and other weapons? So they are now the richest terrorist organization ever. So do you see any contradiction there?
Sorry, is this to me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's clearly clear contradiction. I think your eloquent speakers that I've just been listening to over the phone can put it far better than me. And George Galloway has made this point in Parliament. On the one hand, we're funding them in Syria, and those same fighters then are going to be bombed in Iraq, and calling themselves ISIS. So the fact of the matter is, we've created this bogeyman. I mean, I don't want to go back into history, back into 1915, when all this really starts, and we prop up this state, Saudi Arabia, that goes and exports this type of ideology around the world due to its petrodollars, all of that type of stuff. Fine, we are where we are, but the fact of the matter is, even today, all the arms that these groups are using coming from...
Stay with us, Asghar. Let's get back to Dr. Barrett. Do you agree, just briefly before we leave you today?
Yes, I would second everything we just heard. This is essentially a self-created enemy. It's the best enemy money can buy.
But this is very controversial. This is not what mainstream media in the US believes.
Well, mainstream media in the U.S. is now an Orwellian propaganda apparatus, putting out the most simplistic and deceptive lies that are really fooling fewer and fewer people every day, thanks to the rise of the alternative media and the globalized media, such as Levant TV.
Dr. Kevin Barrett, also editor at Veterans Today, Military and Foreign Affairs Journal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Asghar, tell us again about the Prime Minister's speech. Tell us exactly about the hate preachers in the UK, and where do you draw the thin line between them and organizations that are peaceful, just maybe introducing people to Islam or even lobbying for more Muslim acceptance in the West generally?
You're going to have to forgive me. I don't buy this argument of hate preachers. This is the propaganda narrative, in my humble opinion, of the right wing, because what they cannot admit to the British public is it's their foreign policy that drives extremism. Their foreign policy drives terrorism, not hate preachers, not the fairies under the bed, not the troll under the bridge.
When you mentioned the UK or the West's foreign policy calls for reactions and terrorism, are you justifying terrorism here? That if you don't like something in the West, then you should retaliate by imposing terror, be it in the West or the Middle East?
No, that's an argument.
Just clarifying.
That's an argument of and I've heard this. I know it's not your argument. You're putting the point to me, but that's an argument of people who don't know history. There is no people on earth in the history of this world who have been brutalized as much as the Muslims have been brutalized. Millions murdered, 500,000 children killed in Iraq, 1 million murdered in the war, 1 million died due to sanctions. Palestine ethnically cleansed, Kashmir. Just let me finish this one point, yeah? And have not taken to violence. The Russian Revolution, violent. The British Revolution, Cromwell, violent. The French Revolution, violent. Blacks against slavery, violent. India, where we think that Gandhi was some peaceful person who overthrew the British, wrong. Bose used violence, who was another famous nationalist leader in India. I know he's erased out of history, but he was violent.
Asghar, with all due respect, Asghar, let's just allow Robert Olds to interject here.
There is a situation where, of course, most of the fighting there is geopolitical. A lot of these groups are influenced by geopolitical considerations, their own political interests, as well as their own economic interests. But of course, I don't think you can rule out the effect that certain preachers will have. There's people from this country, from the United Kingdom, that are going to serve with ISIS, going to fight with them and persecute other Muslims that happen to be Shia Muslims, yet they have been radicalised. They have found that they don't have any other way of expressing themselves apart from through very strict interpretation of Islam, and actually persecuting other groups. So that's not geopolitical. There is actually an element which is, of course, the impact that certain people funded by Saudi Arabia who have been spreading these warped beliefs have been encouraging weak-minded people in this country.
Yes, stay with us, please, Mr. Bukhari. We are now joined by Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, media commentator and host of the renowned Jesse Lee Peterson radio show in America. Welcome to Straightforward.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. What do you think of Joe Biden's comments at Harvard University regarding Saudi Arabia, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, saying they had supported terrorism and then having to apologize? Is it acceptable that the US Vice President makes such a hiccup?
It is acceptable. He told the truth. It's unfortunate that because he and Obama are cowardly men, that Biden is now going around this country apologizing for telling the truth. And that's what has happened to our country since Barack Obama has been president over the last 6 years. Barack Obama is a very weak man. He has apologized for the strength of America. He's gone around the country, around the world and said that we're not a Judeo-Christian nation, that we're a nation of people and different religions and things like that. And it's just weakness, and as a result of that, America is now suffering due to the weakness of Barack Obama and Joe Biden.
Yes, and Reverend Peterson, you talk about groups in the United States being radicalized. Tell us more about that and what you think should be done to address this dangerous matter, in your opinion.
Over the last 40 to 50 years or so, Black Americans, not all, but Black Americans have been made to believe that white Americans are against them. They've been told that whites are racist, and so a lot of Black people are angry about that. And then they have been told that Christianity is not the Black man's religion, that it's the white man's religion. And because most Blacks are racist towards whites,
are you talking here about black African Americans who are initially Christians being converted?
Yes.
And converted only or radicalized as well?
Both, yes. They have been converted because they believe now that Christianity is the white man religion. So you have Islam coming along and telling them that Islam is the Black man's religion.
But
and
who is funding this within the communities in the US where Black Africans, African Americans are common?
Saudi Arabia.
Well, it started out with Louis Farrakhan, and Louis Farrakhan is a Muslim here in this country, and he is teaching that in prisons and jails and high schools around the country. And a lot of these Black men are angry, and when you're angry like that, it's easy to believe a lie. But we're telling them that Islam is not a religion, it is a political movement, it is an evil movement, and that they should not go that way. And it's working in some cases, but now that ISIS is on the move, and some of them are now in our country, they are now radicalized.
Our guest here, Robert Olds, would like to also join this conversation. Please let's let him speak.
This fits in with what I was saying at the start of the show. I was talking about radicalism in the UK, and there is a similar thing that's happening in the UK, probably to less of a degree, but of course there's people who have found themselves in prison, people who are not doing well in life, that people who feel alienated, that want a brand to belong to, that want a sense of identity that Britain is currently not giving them. They may come from all different ethnicities, and these people are being targeted when they're vulnerable, if they are in prison, even if they are at university, when they, of course, don't have an identity themselves, and they're looking for something else, and they found radical Islam, and they become radicalized, and then later become militants, and may even go out to Syria to be fighting.
Asghar Bukhari, do you believe that not belonging or maybe not integrating in a society in the West would lead to you being radicalized and supporting groups like the ISIS?
No, what it is at least one of your guests, the Christian speaker from America, is typical of these kind of backward mindset that cannot accept Muslims as human beings. You see, if you kill an American, a white
Peterson
American, let me finish my point, please.
He's not a Christian figure per se in America, just to clarify.
Can I finish my point?
He's a very famous media figure.
Can I finish my point?
Yes.
The point is this. Can I finish my point? Well, once again, you're not letting me finish my point because you're scared of the truth coming out. The fact of the matter is, when 9/11 happened and America killed 1 million people in revenge of 9/11, it was acceptable to Americans because white people died. But when 1 million Muslims are killed by American bombs, then they can't understand why a Muslim would want to take up violence to stop that. It's okay, they can take up violence.
It can't have been in revenge for 9/11 because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11.
Why can they not understand when Muslims die, Muslims feel the same way about their brothers?
You're not being honest about 9/11. It wasn't just white people died. Black people died, Hispanics died, Muslims died.
About 100 Muslim persons died between residents in 9/11 and evacuators and first aid
Of course, need to remember that 9/11 was used as an excuse for the American regime change in Iraq, which has created so many problems that, of course, all unfolding to this day and are still going on.
Are you saying it was fabricated there?
No, I'm not saying it's fabricated at all, but it was used. There is absolutely no link between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the destruction of the Twin Towers. They tried to claim that there was. That is absolutely not the case. That was the wrong target. But of course, it was fitted in with American foreign policy to remove the regime in Iraq to try and rebuild a country there. But also, Iraq wanted to move away from the dollar as a source of purchasing and selling oil. So really that was a large part of it. Also, of course, Iraq was very opposed to Israel and of course under Saddam Hussein, and of course America wouldn't tolerate that. That's quite natural, and of course had destabilized the region itself to a degree, sometimes doing America's bidding in Iran, sometimes rather opaquely in Kuwait. But there is absolutely no link between Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and the terrorists destroyed 9/11.
Yes.
They destroyed the Twin Towers because, of course, that was a very different regime. But unfortunately, it's those kind of regimes that have been attacked by America, leaving a void where the extremist radicals have come to the fore.
Asghar, do you agree with this? And tell me a little bit about the back to the fundamentalist groups that are viewed by the Prime Minister, for example, back to his speech at the UN General Assembly, cracking down on hate preachers. Tell me a little bit again, where do you draw the line as a Muslim community? You've not taken to the streets in England to denounce what the likes of Anjem Choudhury have preached, calling people to go to the caliphate in Iraq, calling the British youth. We've not seen Muslims, moderate Muslims like yourself, take to the streets to denounce what another Muslim like Anjem Choudhury has called for.
Neither should you. Why should we ever go out on the streets to denounce?
It does affect your reputation, that's why.
Israel killed 2,000 Palestinians, 500 of them children, a few weeks ago. Not a single Jew was asked to come out on the streets and denounce Israel. But when a Muslim...
they do exist. People in this country were marching. Christian people, people from no religion were marching in London against the actions of Israel in Gaza. So that is actually happened in this country. There was condemnation of Israeli actions within Gaza. So many people criticise Israel and its policy towards the Palestinians and, of course, the occupation of various lands and so forth. So really, there is a case that actually some other people have spoken up.
Yeah, Reverend Peterson, do you agree? And what is the situation in America within the Muslim communities? Are they denouncing hate preachers? Are they cutting funds to charities that are suspicious when it comes to their support of the ISIS, the Islamic State, or the Islamic State ideology?
Well, Carl, the Muslims are not marching and denouncing terrorism in this country either, and they're not going to do it because the Quran says give them permission to deceive the infidels. And in their minds, the infidels are the Christians and the Jews. And so they believe in that. They're trying to radicalize the entire world and take over. And their intent is to kill the Christians and Jews and get them out of the way. And that's why you see them supporting ISIS, Hamas, and Al-Qaeda and others.
How many Western countries have the Muslims invaded?
These people believe that it's okay to lie, to deceive.
How many countries have the Muslims invaded?
In order to...
Obama has attacked 8 Muslim countries since he's been in power.
Israel has no other choice but to defend itself from these radical evil groups. And Hamas, for example, is putting Muslim children in the way of bombing from Israel. So they're setting their own people up. That's how wicked they are.
But then again, obviously, you're talking about the radicalized ones, I assume, Reverend Peterson. You're not talking about Muslims in general.
Well, there are. I mean, I know what you mean. I'm sure you can find exceptions to the rule. But until they come out and march with us and protest with us and admit that Islam is an evil religion and beheading and
have you invited them to join your discourse? Are they willing to join?
I'm sorry?
Did you invite them? Did you attempt to include them in your rhetoric?
We have tried over and over again for years to invite them to our rallies, to come on my radio show and denounce Islam and this attack on American
How are they going
to
denounce their own religion, Reverend Peterson? I don't think you will denounce your religion. I wouldn't denounce my religion. They could only denounce a wrong version or a wrong interpretation of their religion.
If my religion taught to behead men and women because they disagree with them, or they taught that another religion was evil and its intent you can deceive them in order to kill them. If it were taught that women and children should be treated as second-class citizens, there is no way I would be a part of that religion, because that religion is not of God. It is straight out of hell.
Jesse Lee Peterson, what are your suggestions for the administration to crack down on funding within the US, funding ISIS or Islamic State ideology?
I think that they need to stop funding them immediately I think they need to put boots on the ground there in Iraq and Syria, and they need to have bombing from the air. They need to kill these people before they kill us. They're on the move.
Reverend Lee Peterson, also founder of the South Central LA Tea Party and president of Bond and Bond Action organizations, whose purpose is to educate and motivate and rally Americans. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. They can check us out at Bond.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Thank you. And back to you, Asghar. Do you believe in this rhetoric about killing them before they kill us?
Well, you can see the problem there. So what you had is someone who may be considered a nationalist American who sounds to the rest of the world like he's a member of the Ku Klux
But he is from a minority like yourself, Asghar.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
He is also from a minority group. He is an African American, so just like you in the UK. So you're calling him a nationalist, but he is a minority also.
He may be a minority, but his sentiment is a growing sentiment within the US. So it's not a minority sentiment.
But we're talking here about a very famous media figure in the US. Most of Americans...
backward Christian fanatical extremist sentiment that wants a clash of civilizations.
But we're talking here about a very popular figure in the US, Asghar.
Yeah, which proves the point that there's more extremists in the US than there is in the whole of the Muslim world. The most extreme, violent, fanatical force comes out of the US because of men like this. You heard from his own mouth him saying that we have to wipe out people, we have to bomb them, we have to kill them. This is bin Laden times 10,000. And yet he's considered a mainstream figure in the US, which proves the point. The whole rhetoric about hate preachers is warped and skewed. The Muslims are have no weaponry, have no arms, have no ability to fire planes or even make planes, and yet here this man who and people like him, like George Bush and etc., and their Christian fanaticism are launching the most militarized state on earth against a defenseless population, and millions are dying as a result of it.
Asghar Bukhari, founding member of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So back to you, Robert. Do you agree with what happened a bit ago between Reverend Peterson and Asghar? So Asghar is always bringing this rhetoric that because Islam and Muslims have been targeted in Iraq and in the Middle East, that we should give them a break somehow. But do you agree with this?
Well, most of the violence is driven by geopolitical ends. Of course, people will then further seek to justify that by interpretations of religion and use that as an excuse. But ultimately, there's a geopolitical goal there. So it's not just religion. In fact, religion is just the veneer that people will put on trying to achieve economic and political goals. And really, there are allies in the Muslim world that America should be looking at. That would be Iran. That would be the government of President Assad. But when it comes to people like ISIS, those people that have unfortunately gone down that path, there is little negotiation that can be had with them. Really, they need to be engaged. But that would always be by people on the ground, fellow Muslims who will, of course, be suffering and have suffered at the hands of ISIS. But how, of course, did ISIS come about? Many of them came from the Ba'athist party in Iraq. These people were people who were secular, but of course found that Iraq had tried colonialism, it had tried monarchy, it had then tried Ba'athism, which was secular, and then of course had tried American-imposed democracy, and that had failed. And this left people with very little where to go. They had nowhere to go apart from to join up with ISIS to achieve their goals, and of course have since become radicalised and have then become in a situation where there is really no going back for them and need to be dealt with. But this was largely been created by Western intervention in those countries where they don't really understand what is happening or want to create instability and not actually really realising who the country's true friends are and being able to differentiate between allies and enemies and people that want to manipulate American foreign policy for their own sectarian goals.
And now let's talk to Professor James Fetzer, philosopher of science and conspiracy theorist. Welcome to Straightforward.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Professor Fetzer, tell us a little bit about what you believe is a reversal of US foreign policy since 9/11.
Well, it's really quite shocking that the United States has become a leading aggressor nation in the world. Before 9/11, the official policy of the United States was to never attack any nation that had not attacked it first. And yet, after 9/11, within a month, we had invaded Afghanistan, and not long thereafter, Iraq. And it's rather clear now that this was a part of the extension of the project for the new American century to destabilize these countries in the Middle East that posed a counterbalance to Israeli domination of the region from the Tigris Euphrates to the Nile.
But that's a bit extreme. You're getting into Zionist ideology at the moment, which is not really. But anyway, back to our subject. In terms of financial and military support, can you elaborate more on what you say is, in another interview, you said, I shall quote here, ISIL is a creation of the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. But how is this feasible?
Well, it's not any stretch. I mean, we have ample evidence for it. It's being advised by an American general named Valali. We're spending $200 million every week supporting and attacking it. We're on both sides of the issues. The European Union ambassador to Iraq has admitted the EU is buying oil from ISIS. This appears to be a creation of the Western powers funded by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates. And a particularly treacherous dimension of this insidious action by the United States, where we appear to be taking out the infrastructure of Syria, not attacking ISIS, is that President Obama has threatened to wipe out Syria's air defense system and topple the Syrian government itself if President Assad orders his forces to shoot down American planes. What the Syrian government should do is rescind its permission for the United States to fly over Syria, go to the United States, expose the treachery, close Syrian airspace to allow only Syrian, Iranian, and Russian fighters, install the most advanced Russian anti-aircraft system to preserve the integrity of the nation, which Obama is seeking to subvert.
This is being used as an excuse by the United States to create regime change in Syria. It's been their long-term goal. That was actually, there was meant to be a military action against the government of President Assad last year. That was thwarted by a vote in the House of Commons because the British people did not want to be getting involved in the war in Syria. And of course, the situation is that they've been destabilising Syria, but now been using the excuse of ISIS to try and get involved and to try and spread the meme that the problem is with President Assad, when of course he's actually fighting these people and he's actually engaged with these militant groups. So America is certainly using this as an excuse to get involved, which is deeply regrettable because they should be assessing who their allies are in reality. And of course at the moment America is allied with the wrong sides or in reality, but of course favouring groups which are extremists, when of course there's President Assad who of course can indeed take the fight to ISIS, and America should be assessing its policies and looking at supporting Assad instead of opposing him, and instead of using extremists as a way of trying to create further regime change, which will only end in more slaughter.
Do you agree, Professor Fetzer?
Yes, I do. I completely agree. Barack Obama had a problem when he wanted to lob cruise missiles into Syria on the basis of the claim that the Assad government had used gas. We know that to be false. Putin provided a 50-page. Vladimir Putin provided 50 pages of documentation. Prince Bandar, Saudi Arabia, appears to have been instrumental in providing them with the gas. But the fact of the matter is, cruise missiles would have not only violated Syria's integrity, but would have brought about many more deaths than the alleged gas attacks. The American public were outraged by the very idea. By a ratio of like 99-1, they opposed it. Obama, therefore, had a marketing and public relations problem, which he has sought to solve by creating and marketing ISIS as this threat, most revealingly with the Khorasan group, which was invented out of thin air in order to claim it posed an imminent threat to the United States in order to justify American strikes in Syria without securing the permission of the United Nations Security Council. Under the UN Charter, one nation is allowed to attack another only with the permission of the Security Council. unless it poses an imminent threat. So to circumvent
and regime
that
change
requirement
is illegal. That is a fact, and for a very good reason, that it will not end well. And of course, when it came to the chemical attack, there was a report from the United Nations which suggested that it could have actually been the rebels in Syria. Getting to the truth will be very difficult, but the Western media presented it as President Assad's government. Of course, it's all very convenient because the red line had been drawn by Barack Obama saying they would only get involved if there was a chemical attack, and then they would definitely become involved and start bombing Syria. And then, of course, strangely, there was this chemical attack. So who's actually benefiting from this? Certainly wouldn't have been President Assad and his government there. But he earlier made some very interesting points about the neoconservatives and their attitude. Of course, the neoconservatives who are behind the new American...
So do you think this was a trick to attack, basically, the chemical weapons accusation was, or could be, like you said?
Whoever did it is very difficult to tell because there's a war going on, but it was being definitely used as a way of an excuse for regime change. At that point in time, about more than 100,000, I think 140,000 people had died in Syria. A handful of people died as this attack, which was absolutely dreadful. But of course, they were using that as a red line to try and say that Assad has now crossed over, and then to give them a moral justification to get involved, as well as a legal one, when of course it would have been actually against the UN rules. But largely, the American opposition to President Assad began long before the chemical attack. So who was responsible? But it's difficult to say. But it was definitely being used as an excuse. But of course, if there is regime change, if there is an attack on the Syrian government, for all the rights or wrongs of that government, they will only lead to more bloodshed. And we need to be very careful about regime change because it never ends well. There is not a case in history when it ends well.
Professor Fetzer, do you believe that this US-led coalition now in Syria under the title of cracking down on ISIS is also a way to get in and get into regime change eventually in Syria? Because obviously the regime has resisted for 3 years.
Oh, absolutely, no doubt about it. In fact, even Victoria Nuland, an Undersecretary of State, has admitted on a national talk show that we're there not to attack ISIS, but to undermine Assad. The idea is to take out the infrastructure, taking out grain silos, oil refineries, bridges, and so forth, so that Assad is greatly weakened and easier to topple. That's the whole idea. And we cannot begin to understand this without appreciating that it's being driven by the Zionist ideology to create the greater Israel. That's the whole idea. It motivated the project for the new American century. It was used to arrange 9/11, which involved collaboration between the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense, and the Mossad.
But don't you think, Professor Fetzer, that there should be, especially now, an alliance somehow, a military alliance with Assad, especially that the US does not want boots on the ground. So how are they going to finish? Excuse me for the term, how are they going to finish the ISIS if they don't ally with someone there on the ground while they don't want to step a foot on the ground?
My opinion is that we ought to close Syrian airspace to Americans.
Why just to Americans and open it to Russia, Iran, and the others?
Because they're actually interested in getting rid of ISIS and in supporting Assad. And I think Iran would be well...
But Russia is interested in protecting Assad as well. China is somehow interested as well. They're just all, obviously they all agree on one thing. They do not want to back terrorism. But what I meant is, you spoke a bit earlier about Obama and you don't really believe in this whole campaign. Yet at the same, so basically, does this validate your former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's critique of President Obama? So as to the timing of going in, she believes obviously that all this laissez-faire in Syria has paved the way for more support and more financial support to be channeled into the terrorist hands, and that's why they gained momentum. She believes that if the Obama administration launched the campaign initially, ISIS wouldn't have taken over these large parts in Iraq and massacred all these people and eradicated the Christians and nearly attacked, obviously, American interests in the Kurdish areas in Iraq.
Well, the fact is there's a lot of theater going on here. The beheadings are fake. They're staged. There's no real blood. They appear to have been brought to us on the same soundstage that brought us innocents of Muslims. This is very much an Israeli operation, in my opinion, and it's Obama may overtly have differences with Benjamin Netanyahu, but if you look at his actions, what he's doing is furthering the goals of Israel by deconstructing the modern Arab state so they can't serve as a counterbalance. General Wesley Clark explained to us that after 9/11, he was informed by a general at the Pentagon that we had a plan to destabilize 7 Arab countries, well, one being actually Persian, Iran, in the next 5 years. And when he asked why, the general explaining this to him said, I don't know. We just seem to be good at this sort of thing. And then he recollected a conversation he'd had with Paul Wolfowitz explaining that the United States needed to go in and create chaos in the Middle East so that we could take control of it. But there's no possibility of taking control of it. The whole idea was to take chaos, remove the secular governments of Syria and Iran in order to, Iraq, in order to let the conflicting factions of Shia, Sunni, and Kurd would turn them into little warring statelets,
they argue it's going to be a very long war, 30 years, they say.
Well, that's just ridiculous. The United States now has adopted the policy that permanent warfare. I mean, it's ridiculous. We are a military-industrial state, and we are very much a police state, and everyone is under surveillance here. It's a ridiculous situation. Efforts are going to be made to clamp down on the internet, too, so that we can't even have conversations like this. It's a terrible, terrible situation.
Professor James Fetzer, also distinguished McKnight University professor and professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Thank you very much for your remarkable contribution today.
My pleasure.
And Robert Olds, what do you think of the American crackdown on banks, where it was suspected that some money from these bank accounts have been channeled to ISIS? They were obviously owned by Muslim owners, these bank accounts. Do you think the UK might follow suit by taking no risks there and closing any forms of supply from their main source?
Well, certainly should, but of course needs to remember that the United States, allies in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, those countries, Turkey as well, have been allowing these funds to go through. So it's a very
even from the UK and via the UK?
Well, the UK is a very important financial centre, and so often funds transfer through and may not necessarily know where they're going.
In British banks, they own whole British banks like Barclays.
Yes, they do. They own many shares and the majority stakes
So do you
in
think
various.
the UK is in a position, they're pressured by these states, Saudi Arabia, you mentioned, and Qatar?
Well, Britain just has a sort of habit of going along with what the United States wants, for good or ill. Often this ends up rather badly and gets the UK into trouble. Many people believe that Britain needs the defence of America, but one of the reasons why we need to be defended by America is, of course, we're friends with America, which creates problems for Britain around the world, because American foreign policy has been one of destabilising other countries. This is a fact. They've been getting involved in regime change, be that from Libya to Ukraine and countries beyond, but of course don't do nation building and leave countries in chaos, where of course radical groups come to the fore, and there's always ultimately violence, which is deeply regrettable.
Now, as this rather interesting episode comes to an end, let me thank our studio guest, Mr. Robert Olds, also member of the British Conservative Party, and thanks to our other interlocutors in random order, Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, president of bodinfo.org, who joined us from Los Angeles, and Professor James Fetzer from Madison, Wisconsin, and Dr. Kevin Barrett, also from Wisconsin, Professor Max Abrahms from Boston, and Dr. Stephen Lendman from Chicago, and also Asghar Bukhari joined us over the phone from here in the UK. I'll be with you again soon for another frank debate on Straightforward, and bye for now.